One of the important sugyas in Muktzah that we're learning these days is the sugya of Shivrei Keli. And the Mishnah on Kuf Chaf Dalit Amid Beis records a machlokes between the Tanakama, between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda regarding Shivrei Kelim. According to the Tanakama, Kol HaKelim Nitolim B'Shabbos, Shivreim Nitolim Imoyah, Ubilvad Shiu Osim Me'ein Malacha. And the Gemara explains that Me'ein Malacha means that you can use it for whatever you have to use it for, any use is possible, and that's enough to be matir tilted. And then the Mishnah records the dissenting view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer no, Ubilvad Shiu Osim Me'ein Malachta. Imagine you have a receptacle and it cracked a little bit, but it still is a receptacle. That's what it looks like, and that's how it functions. Only then is there a heter tilted. If, on the other hand, you can use it for some other tashmish, that's not sufficient. To use it for another tashmish, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is not going to be matir tilted. So one of the things we want to accomplish in the short amount of time that we have is try to understand, get a framework, and some sort of an insight into this machlokes between the Tanoim in the Mishnah. The Gemara goes on to tell us that in a case of, for example, a glima, a kli gomur, if he would throw it into the ashba on Erev Shabbos, lo batel minei shem kli, it still is mutar b'tilta. As Tosfos explains here on the top of Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. However, in the case of Shivrei Kelim, there's a different din, and it depends when he threw it out. If he threw it out on Shabbos, then there's no Dechia on Shabbos. If, on the other hand, he threw it out on Erev Shabbos, then Batel Minei Shem Kli, and of course, there's an Isur Tilta. We'd like to understand the difference between the case of Glima, which, to our surprise, even though he threw it out, it still remains mutar b'tiltul, as opposed to Shivrei Kelim. So we're going to start our shir today by trying to understand a little bit more about Shivrei Kelim. The paradigm of Shivrei Kelim on a Doraisa level is the issue of Kabbalas Tumah. The Rambam paskins regarding the din of Shivrei Kelim in Perek Yud Ches Hilchos Kelim. According to the Rambam, Kol HaKelim Shenishbru, B'nifsidot Surasam. The Tzuras HaKli is gone. Ein Shivreim Makabel Tumah. In such a case of Shivrei Kelim, there's no Kabbalas Tumah. Why? Because Nifsidot Surasam. Afal Pisha Osam Shvarim Re'uyim L'Tashmish. You could use the Shvarim, but once it's Nifsidot Surasam, then it's Paka Minei Shem Tuma. It's not a Kli because it's not enough to be royal L'Tashmish. What you need is a Tzuras HaKli. Chutz, the Rambam has one exceptional material, Shivrei Kli Cheres, if it can still retain something that you put into it, it still has a receptacle, it has a kli kibul, then even though it is nifsidat suraso, harehu mekabel tumah. The Ram derives this from a special yalfusa, shenemar v'chol kli cheres, and mipi Shmuel lamdu, Shezelo boil rabos shivrei kli cheres. So you have a shivrei kli cheres, and here the Rambam establishes that it still retains its status as a kli, bless you, leading Kabbalas Tumah, despite the fact that it lost its tzura because it is roy l'tashmish, it's roy l'kabel. Now, we should point out that the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Kelim, in Perek Hey, Halacha Aleph, which is a very long and complicated halacha, for that you have to really know, your beans about Kelim, but the Rambam establishes in Perek Hey, Ein Olav tsuras kli, he says when you're making and manufacturing a kli, if it doesn't have a tsuras kli, afal pisha mishtamshin bo, eino makabel tumah. You can see from the Rambam that tsuras hakli is critical. When you have a kli that you began to manufacture, but it's not complete yet, it's functional, but it still doesn't have a tsuras kli, the Rambam says it's not a kli li kabbalas tumah, it will not be makabel tumah.
What's mean tsuras kli?
Tsuras kli means that when you look at it, like if you go online and you want to order something from Amazon, you'll see something that looks like a kli. It has the function of a kli.
What's something that does that?
In other words, it has a crack in it, but it still has a tsuras hakli. So now we have the following. Let's just summarize what we have. In the Rambam, we say the following, that as far as all kelim, with the exception of kli cheres is concerned, even though at one point in time it was a kli and it was makabel tumah, you manufactured not only a kli, which is royal attachment, but it also has, says around a tsuras kli. If in subsequent time period it lost its tsuras kli, and that's called Shivre Kelim, then paka minei shem kli. And if paka minei shem kli, it's not makabel tumah.
Now, say this.
I don't know about 8, so I'm focused now on kli cheres. So if you, only on kli cheres. The Rambam has a special drasha from which he derives the conclusion that in the case of kli cheres, even though it lost its tsuras kli, since it has a function, it's royal attachment, it remains a kli as far as kabbalas tumah is concerned. Let's now see if we can use kabbalas tumah of kelim as a paradigm. We say, kol the tikkun rabbanan kein toraisa tikkun. When the rabbanan established the laws of muktzah and the Isur tiltul kelim, they used the shem kli as it applies to tumas kelim, to kabbalas tumah. If that be the case, then you'll see in front of you two choices. Rabbi Yehuda is going to take one approach, the Chachamim another. Let's take the Chachamim Shita. The Chachamim focus their attention on the Kli Cheres model. In the case of the Kli Cheres, there's a Chumrah in Tumah, which will turn into a Kula with regard to Shabbos. What do I mean? The Kula in Tumah is that a kli cheres? I'm sorry, the chumrah in tumah is that a kli cheres, despite the fact that it lost its tsuras kli, but simply because it has a tashmish, it retains its shem kli. And that's, of course, a chumrah if you're talking about tumah. It's makabel tumah. If this becomes the model for Shabbos, for tiltul on Shabbos, then we have a great kula, hence the sheet of the Chachamim. As long as the kli functions in any sort of capacity, it still has a shem kli. In Tumah, that's bad news, because then it's makabel Tumah. But in Shabbos, if it still retains a shem kli, that's a kula, and hence the Chachamim and Mishnah will be matir tiltul kelim, in a case of Shivrei Kelim, because it still has a tashmish. Whatever tashmish it has, whatever you can use it for. You can have a broken kli, it has a shard, and it has no tsuras hakli, but you use it to wipe off cement or some mud that fell on your garment, and that's enough, according to the Chacham, to be matir tiltul. But Rabbi Yehuda looks at the Chacham and he says, why mehechatesi? Why do you use the model of kli cheres? In Hilchas Tumah, let's look at all kelim in general. And there the halacha is that as soon as it loses its tsuras hakli, nifsad tsuras hakli, it loses its shem kli. And therefore it's not makabel tumah. If that be the case, then applying that to Hilchas Shabbos, if it loses its shem kli, it's not a receptacle like the original, you can use it in this way or that way. It's Paka Shem Kli. Why do you use the model of Kli Cheres, which is the exception to the rule, that's derived from a special drasha, as your model, as your paradigm to determine what would be the din on Shabbos of Heter Kelim? It would make more sense, says Rabbi Yehuda, to use Kol HaKelim, meaning all Kelim, with the exception of the Gzeres HaKos of Kli Cheres, as your model, as your paradigm for Hilchot Shabbos. And therefore, once it loses its Tzuras HaKli, Paka Mimenu Shem Kli. And therefore, in all Kelim, with the exception of the Gzeres HaKosuv, in Kli Cheres, which the Rambam derives from Apostle, once it loses its Tzuras HaKli, it's not a Kli. And if it's not a Kli, then it's also B'tiltel on Shabbos. Unless it's Me'en Malachton, what you see in front of you is the original function of the Kli, and then I can say that it still retains its Tzuras HaKli. I would even go a step further. I would like to suggest that it could be that according to Rabbi Yehuda, even in the case of a Kli Cheres that lost its Tzuras HaKli, Pacham Mimenu Shem Kli. It could be that Rabbi Yehuda understood that there's a separate din in Tumah that's derived from a pasuk, what we call niyug tumah. In other words, the Torah says that even though it really is not a kli, but nevertheless we're going to be noig with it in Hilchos Tumah as if it were a kli, but it's really not a kli. The fact that it's tameh is a gzeras hakosov that applies only in the framework of Tumah. But now you want to extrapolate to Shabbos. Then I'm going to tell you that even from the perspective of Kli Cheres, with the loss of the Tzuras HaKli, Hakami Menu Shem Kli, and it's also B'tiltel. And according to this, perhaps we can shed a new light on Tosas here that I mentioned earlier, Kuf Chaf Hey Amid Aleph, regarding the difference between a glima and a case of Shivrei Keilim. What Tosas says is that in the case of a glima, even if I threw it into the rubbish bin on Erev Shabbos, it still is mutter b'tiltel. Shein Kain in the case of Shivrei Keilim, once I take Shivrei Keilim and I throw it out on Erev Shabbos, again, you can't be mevatel a kli on Shabbos, but on Erev Shabbos, then Paka Mimenu Shem Kli. And we can begin to understand the fundamental difference between the case of a glima and the case of Shivrei Keilim. In the case of a glima, it's a complete kli. Nothing is missing to this garment. It's a kli gamur. And in the case of a kli gamur, even if you throw it into the garbage, it doesn't matter. Lo pacham mimenu shem kli. It's still a kli. Masha'en came in the case of Shivrei Keilim. There, it doesn't have a shem kli in the full sense. It's not really a heft of a kli. Because once it's broken, it doesn't have a tzuras hakli. Ella what? We're saying that, according to the Chacham of Yehuda, we're going to borrow from the model of Kli Cheres. So I'm going to say that since it has a tashmish, that's why a Kli Cheres, even though it forfeited its tzuras hakli, but since it has a tashmish of a kli, therefore, it has a din of a kli as far as Kabbalah's Tumah is concerned, and then the Chacham extrapolated and compared Tumah to Tiltul Muktzah in Shabbos to that same din. So when you have Shivrei Keilim, you're talking about a brand new Shem Kli. What generates the Shem Kli? The Tashmish. It's not the Tzuras HaKli that generates the Shem Kli, but rather the Tashmish HaKli. Oh, is it Omed L'Tashmish? And the answer is, if he took the Kli, and the Shever Kli, I mean to say, and he threw it where? Into the rubbish bin, then it's not Omed L'Tashmish. So when you're talking about a Chefs of a Kli, which means it's objectively a Kli, it has a Shem Kli, it has not only a Tashmish of a Kli, but it also has a Tzuras HaKli, it has a full-fledged status like the Glima of a Kli Gamur, then you're not going to be able to be Mavatal Shem Kli, even if you threw it into the Ashpa. But in the case of Shivrei Keilim, which doesn't have a Shem Kli based on its Tzura, but rather what generates the Shem Kli is the Tashmish, then you're talking about the das b'nei adam. Now it depends upon the person. The kli itself is not a kli gomel. Its shame kli is not generated by the tzura, but rather by the tashmish. Is it omeg l'tashmish? And the answer is, if he took the kli and he threw it into the rubbish bin, it's no longer omeg l'tashmish, and therefore it doesn't even have shame of a kli l'tashmish. It's not a kli tashmish because it wasn't a kli gomer to begin with. Then he threw it into the ashpa, and he was mafkia the shame kli tashmish, which was the only shame that he had. If he had a full-fledged kli gomer or a shame kli because it had a tzura kli, like a glima, which is a whole complete kli, you can't be mavatal the shame kli. I don't care where you put it and where you throw it, because it's objective. It's not subjective. But if we're talking about a shever kli, which only is upgraded to the status of a kli because it has a tashmish, then it has to be omed l'tashmish. And the baldover here took it. I don't mean that baldover, but I mean the bala kli, right? Took the broken kli and he put it where? Into the ashpa. What does that mean? It's no longer omed l'tashmish. It doesn't even have the basic, shall I call it, the fallback shame kli of a kli l'tashmish.
It's part of the Kli Teres is different than are together by what's requires something that's right process of Kli. Ram requires something much more by Teres. Because that it's something that has its own lakabel and something that is so with itself.
Well, I think what he means by lakabel is that what you have is a receptacle, right? What's the purpose and the function of receptacle? What's its tashmish? The Rambam is looking for a broken kli that still has a tashmish. So the Rambam uses the kli kibul case as his paradigm case because you can have a broken kli and yet it's still conserved as a receptacle. The Chachamim took that halacha and they broadened it to apply to tiltul muktzah. And even though it's a chumrah and hilchas tumah, that that vestige, that shirayim in the kli, that it still functions in some capacity as a kli kibul, gives it a shame kli, and that's the chumrah of a kli cheres that's derived from a pasuk. Then it's makabel tumah. The Rambam is going to paskin like the Chachamim, and it's going to generate a kula in hilchas Shabbos, which means that if we can use kli cheres as our jumping off point, right? Keresh kvitzah, as we call it, for the din of Kelim in general with regard to Muktzah and Shabbos, because again, what the Rabbanan are looking for is a kula. They're not looking for a separate chumrah. They just want to know if somewhere in the world of Kelim we could have a shem keli that is generated by its tashmish. That's going to be fine for the Chachamim, and we're going to use that shem kli, the shem tashmish of the kli, for the sake of tiltul muktzah. And Rabbi Yehuda says, what kind of logic is that? In the case of Tumah, let's look at all Kelim. Oh, you'll tell me, but you have a Kli Cheres. Why should you use the exception to the rule? Call the Tikkur Rabbanan Keito Raisa Tikkur. And furthermore, I'm not even sure, says Rabbi Yehuda, that you're correct in assuming that there is a shame Kli in the case of a Kli Tashmich and Kli Cheres. It could be a Kli Cheres. That's halach in Tumah V'Tara. The Torah was mechadish that it's makabel tumah. Say it one more time.
So you're saying your users don't build from Cheres.
Don't. I didn't hear the list, but don't
build from Cheres.
Right. Don't derive from Cheres.
So you're build from start Kelim.
Exactly.
Where does the Rambam say in start Kelim that if you have any off ratio, that five colors?
The Rambam says that as long, in the case of Kli Cheres, what you're talking about in general case. In general, the Rambam says that if nifsedot tzuraso, then even though it was a shem kli, and before that it was royal kabel tumah, once it's nifsedot tzuraso, it doesn't have a shem kli. It's not makabel tumah. And that turns out to be a kulin tumah, but a chumr in Shabbos. If we were to apply this yardstick of kol ha-kelim, you mean row of kelim, of tumah to Shabbos, we would come to the conclusion that even though it has a tashmish, it is still also v'dilpul. You follow?
You could be nefsed of tzurasa, but still have many in the lachar rishama.
I don't think so, at least not in my share, maybe in your share. I'm just trying to give you an explanation. It's my focus. You don't have to accept it. But I'm just trying to suggest what I think is pshat. You can disagree with me, and I respect your opinion greatly. But it seems to me that in Rabbi Yehuda's frame of reference, once you have me'ain malachta or rishona, the malacha and meikara, then it's logical to assume you have a tzura satvi. So if I take the Rambam and I want to apply the Rambam to give me some sort of framework, my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik used to always use Tuma V'Tara in order to shed a light on Muktzah. Okay. Now, based on this explanation, perhaps we could go a little bit further. Let's read the Gemara here on Daf Kuf Chaf Daled Amud Beis. The Gemara says the following: Amar Rav Nachman, Hani livni dishtavia mibeinei. They were shirayim from stones that were designated for construction purposes. Shari l'tultulinu, you're allowed to move them on Shabbos. No Isa tiltul. And why is that? Because chazu lemizgal light, you can sit on them and use them as a chair. However, sharginu, Rashi says he's mesader them one on top of the other. There's aktsar here. He's going to use these leftover bricks, construction bricks, for another construction. And therefore it's awesome to tilt. Now, I don't understand one thing. Rashi is telling us that when the person designates it by placing one stone on top of the other, sidra, that's what the Gemara means by aktsinu. It's a haktsah. Now, I don't understand. Do we find that through haktsah, on something that's a kli, you decide that you want to use it in a different capacity, therefore, batal bimenim shem kli? In Ochlin, we have such a thing. We have grogros v'tzimukim. You can be maktzah b'yadayim. But in Kelim, I only have Tosas who says he threw out his kli into the rubbish bin, and it's not also the tilt. So how do I understand this halacha of haktsah that now removes the shem kli? Say it again? Well, that's going to be my answer. That it's not. But you understand, I just was formulating a question, trying to arouse your curiosity. Yeah, I did. On the Myra McComas page, I pointed out that Rashi. First of all, Rashi says that in the case of, these spare construction stones, lo kaimel abinyan, el leishev alem v'toras kli. Rashi is operating within the frame of the Torah's kli. So therefore, if you want to move these leftover construction stones, you can do so, says Rashi, because they have a Torah's kli. However, shagininu, isidram zel ze bari aktzinu, litzorach binyan acher, has another binyan. And then the impression you get is, if you put the two Rashis together, that Pocket Torah's kli, which I found very strange, just because he decided that he is going to designate this Moshav, right? This is now a Moshav because he finished the first construction. Well, he's going to use it for another construction. Therefore, Pakashim. Right. You know what? Let me just ask you the following question. In the light, Moshe, I'll get back to what you say another time, but just in the light of what we've been saying, can we give a whole new interpretation to this Gemara? Again, let me just feed it to you if I have to, right? I want to go over the main highlights of what I said because Yoni has to leave soon. But the main point is that in the heter tiltul mukta, we have two different categories. We have one category which is a full-fledged kli gamur. It has not only a function, tashmish, it also has what? A tzuras hakli. That's a kli gamur. Then we had another category of heter kelim, at least according to the Rabbanan, called Shivrei Kelim, which is not a Kli Gamur, but it fits into a brand new category of Shem Kli L'Tashmish. And we pointed out that there are two nafkaminas. First of all, the nafkamina of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, meaning, are you allowed to be metal to Shivrei Kelim? And the Rabbanan say, well, we have a new category of a heter that the Rabbanan established, a matir of Shivrei Kelim because of Tashmish, and Rabbi Yehuda denied it. And then we had another nafkamina that when you have a Kli Gamur, even if you decide you're not going to use that Kli Gamur, the Kli demands its own status as a Kli, as long as it's a Kli Gamur, it has a Tzuras HaKli. And the fact that you threw it out is not mafkia the same Kli, and therefore it's still mutar b'tiltul. But if it lost its Tzuras HaKli, and then you have to introduce the Chachamim's fallback position of, namely, it's not a Kli Gamur, it's Shivrei Kelim, but it still has a tashmish. Now you threw it out. Once you throw it out, Haka Shem Kli, not a Kli Gamur. Then you can't be mafkia Kli Gamur, but you could be mafkia the Shem Kli Tashmish. Why? Because you threw it into the rubbish and it's not Omed the Tashmish. Can anybody help me now make the next move about the Avonim, the Levanim for a building? Which category will it be in? Yeah? Yes, it doesn't have a tzuras kli. It has what? A shimush. It has a tashmish. What does it mean? In Kabbalah's Tumah, I have no question in my mind that Avonim are not makabel tumah. No matter how beautiful they are and how much you designate them for building, it does not have a shem kli. It doesn't have a tzuras kli. It's not a kli. But in Hilchas Shabbos, we have another category. And what's the second category? It's a kli because of its shem tashmish. That's what the Gemara is discussing here. With regard to Levanim, that are considered mutar b'tiltul because of its shem kli l'tashmish. And what tashmish do these Levanim have? Once you have completed the structure of the building, and these are extra, these are surplus construction, what tashmish does it have? You can sit on them. You don't have to designate it as such. It's automatically a C because it has a royal tashmish. Says the Gemara in the name of Shmuel, Bamedvar Mamurim, that you yourself have not been mocked to it for a different tashmish. Because now the halacha is that the status of the Avonim and the Levanim in regarding a heter tiltul is generated by the shem tashmish hakli. In Tumah V'Tar, it certainly would not have a tzuras hakli, would not generate Tumah. Now I can ask you the following question. Is it Omed L'Tashmish? And the answer is no, I'm not going to sit on these tables. I've already made my decision on Erev Shabbos that I want to use these stones for construction. And that's not a tashmish, that can be matir tiltul. The Mela, the Gemara says in the name of Nachman, that once you put them one on top of the other, you sidra, and you indicated clearly that you are designating these levanim for construction, for binyan acher in Rashi's language, then Mela, it's not omed l'tashmish, it doesn't have a shem kli tashmish, and therefore it's asur. And then the Gemara goes on to say the following. Omar Rav Nachman, Omar Shmuel, Cheres Ktana, Mutal Etaltel B'Chotz. Aval B'Karmel is low. Rav Nachman Didei Omar, that's what he quoted the name of Shmuel, but he himself holds Afilu B'Karmel. Aval B'Shusarabim low. The Rav Omar Afilu B'Shusarabim. We once discussed this one. You have a small, the Ramban learns that we're talking about Shivrei Kli Cheres. you have a small piece of cheretz, which in the context of your home, and maybe even in your chotzer, possibly even in a caramelis, it's omed l'tashmish. You can use it as the Rabbeinu Chananel emphasizes here, lechaper bo esatino. You have cement or mud that fell on your beged. You're going to use it to wipe it off. Lechaper, to clean off your beged. Both Rav Nachman and Shmuel agree, as Rashi points out here, that it has to be royal and tashmish b'mukoma. Just that Shmuel holds that in Carmelis, it's not royal and tashmish b'mukoma, whereas Rav Nachman holds that even in a Carmelis, it's called royal and tashmish b'mukoma. But both of these Amoraim agree that in order to be matir tiltul, you have to have royal and tashmish b'mukoma. Comes along Rava, he says, even in Rosh Hashanah, it's mutter b'tiltul. Why is it royal attachment in Rosh Hashanah? So Rabbeinu Chananel learns that if he's walking in Rosh Hashanah and there's no Isser of Havaras, Dalaramis, etc., then he could use it, b'shas atchak, maybe once in a lifetime, to be mechaper the tina. The Ramban says, I'll read to you the language of the Ramban, that as far as Rosh Hashanah is concerned, Rava holds the chazi l'didei, very similar to Rabbeinu Chananel, but then he adds the afal gav, the leka olei toras kli, which means that even according to Rava, who is matir tiltul of this shard, of this kli cheres shenishma, right, a shivrei kli, because he could get some tashmish out of it, Rava agrees that it doesn't have a shem kli. As I state Ramban, you can check me out on it. I don't understand the Ramban. If you're telling me it doesn't have a shem kli, then why would Rava be matir tiltul? I mean, that undermines everything that we hold about tiltul kalim. Namely, that once it has a shem kli, it's mutter b'tiltul, but if it loses, it forfeits its shem kli, then it's also b'tiltul. Here the Ramban is saying that it's paka shem kli, even according to Rava, and yet it's mutter b'tiltul. Why? Because l'didei chazile, he might have some use for it. And in general, if we're talking about Kלים, let's say before the Ramban, then Bishleim, I understand Rava very well. Rava makes sense. Rava's saying, I don't need royal attachments b'chol makom. If I have a kli, and it happens to be located in a place where I can't use it, so therefore it's awesome to tilt. How do you understand Rav Nachman and Shmuel that they require that it has to be royal attachments b'mkomo? Why is that so?
Because then there'd be no other places where it wouldn't be royal attachment.
But I'm saying, let's say, I'm just asking this question. You gentlemen are learning Hilchos Muktzah very thoroughly. What would be your answer to the question, if I have a kli, and here it's royal attachment, but there it's not royal attachment?
And not agree.
It would be mutter, for sure.
And
So wait a minute. So let me ask my question, you give me your answer. How could Rav Nachman say, well, since here, in this chotzer, it's not royal attachment, therefore, even though it's a kli, it's also b'tiltul. Why? Because the makom is kover. Why is the makom kover? And what's the answer? The only answer I know is the Ramban. That the Ramban says there is no shem kli. It doesn't have a shem kli. It's a shard. It's a little bit of a broken piece of cheretz. It doesn't have a tzuras hakli. Norvas. It has a shem kli haroyal attachment. And therefore, Rava says, L'shitaso, that even in Rosh Hashanah, it's a klisha royal attachment. But the halacha that it had a change, if the halacha were that we're talking about a shem kli, then the Rishonim, like the Rabbeinu Chananel and the Ramban, would not have to say, well, it's royal attachment. Forget about royal attachment. It has a shem kli. If it has a shem kli, then it's mutter b'tiltul anywhere on the face of the earth, even in a place where you can't use it. But that's only if it has a shem kli gomor. So therefore, the Ramban is, I think, compelled to interpret this Gemara that we're talking about shivrei kli cheres that don't have a shem kli. And if we plug in the Rambam here, it's because it's nevdot tzuraso. So if it doesn't have a tzuras kli, it doesn't have a shem kli. It's a little shard. But Rava holds that it's still mutter b'tiltul. Why? Because of our second category, namely it's a kli aroy l'tashmish. And Rava took this very far, and he said that even if it's just a Rabbim, it's roy l'tashmish. Whereas Rav Nachman and Shmuel did not accept that it's roy l'tashmish in Rishus Rabbim. And since it doesn't have a shem kli, then in Manav Shachar has to be also b'tiltul. B'Torah's kli gomor is paka tzuras hakli, and therefore paka shem kli. Narvas, you have the fallback position, that lower shem kli, which is generated by the tashmish hakli. Well, let's ask the question: is it really royal tashmish? So Shmuel says it's royal tashmish in a chotzer, and Rav Nachman goes a step further and says it's royal tashmish even in a camel. And Rava holds it's royal tashmish even in what? Even in Rishus Rabbim. But it comes out that our case of this cheres ketana is what you call a kli garua, if we can use that term. What do I mean by kli garua? It's lacking in the full-fledged shem kli gomer of tzuras hakli. And for example, in most cases in Kabbalah's Tumah, it would not be Makabal Tumah, with the only exception of kli cheres. And why is that? Because nifsida tzuras hakli. And now we fall back to a kli garua. It's like, hatzah is a mlacha garua. Now we have a kli garua, which means a secondary shem kli, which is generated by its tashmish. And now the Gemara goes into a plukta about what about if it has a tashmish here and it doesn't have a tashmish there. And it being a kli gomer, it would be irrelevant. It would be an improper question to ask, where is its tashmish? I don't need to go into the Torah's tashmish. I have a shem kli because in and of itself it's a cheftzeva kli. And why? Because it has a tzuras kli. But the answer is that this sugi is dealing with a kli garua, meaning it doesn't have the original shem kli gomer of tzuras hakli. It's hefsei kli tzuras hakli. What it has a din of shem tashmish. That's the question. What does he mean by shem kli alav b'chutz? So again, if Rashi disagrees with the Ramban and he holds that in the chutz it has a shem kli gomer, even though it's very broken, it's a shard, then we're going to have to ask all of our questions. And that is, why would it make any difference where it is on the face of the earth? Why does chutzer generate a shem kli? You follow me? That's very difficult to say that it has a shem kli in a chutzer, but not elsewhere. If it has a shem kli, then it's impervious, meaning you can't even touch it. You can't make any dent in it. It has a shem kli. But maybe, with a little bit of a stretch of our imagination, we could take the Ramban, who says explicitly with which it doesn't have a shem kli, and apply it to Rashi, and Rashi's Torah is clear, is the secondary fallback shem kli. Because b'chotzer it's omed l'tashmish, and Rashi holds that since it's in a place where it's royal l'tashmish, that's enough to generate the shem kli. But that wouldn't apply all over the world.
Why do you need a tashmish of the chutzer?
Because I guess Rashi's saying that according to this sheet, again, it depends on the different Amoraim. How often are you going to use it to scrape off, Tina? That's not really an anticipated shchiach tashmish. So therefore, we're looking for, something that could be very shchiach. What did you mention before, Yaakov? I didn't. What do you use it for? You mentioned something.
But in the chutzer would be to cover him.
Right. That's what I meant to say. To cover Kalim. Covering Kalim is a real, what we call Kisun Kalim, that's a real bona fide Tashmish Kalim. Do we consider it royal Tashmish if it's not royal Chassis Kalim, but it's only roy, Lechaper Esadino?
If it's choose one that was a good love, Yeah, Rob, if you choose monogamy, you get out of that, okay? Because in the house.
I think yes, according to Rava, even in this makom, it's royal attachment. Again, the other Amorai might say, no, that's not called royal attachment because of this far out possibility that'll have to clean off the tina. They need something more fundamental that's royal attachment of Tisi Kelen. Then it becomes a kli. It's almost a kli. It doesn't have a tzuras kli, but it can be functional as a kli because it's a kisi kli. So just to summarize, with this we'll end the shir, that it would seem that when we get to the sugya of Shivrei Kelim, we're talking about a brand new breakthrough category of het tilta. We're not talking about the het tilta that we're familiar with, which is appropriate and applicable only to a full-fledged shem kli. But now we generate a new shem kli, which is not a kli gamur, and it's not what we call in the Rambam's language in Ilfus Kelim, a kli that has a tzuras hakli. Where do we get this new concept of a kli that's omed l'tashmish and it gains the shem kli? We get it from the chumrah of kli cheres, where the Rambam says that if our paradigm for defining a kli is tumah v'tara, then what we find within the context of tumah v'tara is that a kli cheres, if it has a function, even if it's batale nifsida tzuras hakli, it still has a shem kli, and it's makabel tumah. That's a chumrah in tumah that, in the flip side, becomes a kula in heted total b'shabbos. And the Chachamim are pressing for this new category of a shem kli l'tachmish. And by the way, the logic I think of the Chachamim is very convincing, because the whole issue of tiltul has to do with vehechim. Vehechinu es asher yaviu min hachana, and hachana is for tashmish purpose. So therefore, if I could find a precedent within the Doraisa frame for a shem kli that's generated not by the way it looks, and even in Shivrei Kelim it has a shem kli, it's makabel tumah, and that's the case of Shivrei Kli Cheres. In Shivrei Kli Cheres, we find that the Torah itself gave the Kli Cheres, the Shivrei Kli Cheres, the shem kli. Why? And the Ram says because it's royal kabel, even though it was hufsida surah. If we take that as our paradigm for tiltul kelim, we can be matir tiltul kelim even in something that lacks the fundamental definition of a kli because it has a status of a tashmish. However, as we pointed out, it's not up to par, so to speak. It's not on the same level as a kli gamur, and therefore, if you throw it out, then it's no longer omed l'shimush, and that's a subjective decision. And we pointed out that Rabbi Yehuda rejects the entire structure because he says that even in tumah v'tara we need a tzuras hakli, and it's got to have a kli cheres is makabel tumah, even though it doesn't have a tzuras hakli. The answer is that's exeris hakpasim. The Torah said that we treat it as if it were a kli, and that's a separate din in kli cheres. That can't form a precedent. We said therefore there might be an afkamina. And with this, we'll conclude an afkamina as far as the case of sharginu, meaning that you have something, namely stones of construction, that are not kelim, but yet, if you could sit on them, then it becomes a kli in order to be matir tiltul. And we ask the question, why is that so? If it doesn't have a shem kli and there's no precedent in Ilchus Tumah V'Tara, the answer is, once it can be used as a seat, it now has the status of a kli haroy l'tashmish. But if, on the other hand, you put one on top of the other, the sadra, and you indicate that you want it for the next building that you're building, then it doesn't have the same kli tashmish. Finally, the other nafkamina with regard to Shivrei Kli Cheres in a Rishus HaRabim. And the way the Ramban defines it, it's Pakat Shem Kli, but since it's only L'tashmish, that's Rav Shita about this small shard in Rishus HaRabim, therefore Rav Paskins it's put to the tiltul, and the other Amoraim say, no, that's not considered Roy L'tashmish, and therefore it's Asumit. Okay, then? Thank you very much. Take this opportunity to wish everyone a great Shabbos, Parshas Vayetz.